How many more painful sacrifices will they need to make, and will they be able to do this?
They need to make a lot more painful sacrifices. Thanks for having me. I think that even just in the first year of the budget window in 2028, they're at least $200 billion short of making this bill Byrd Rule compliant. There's a couple of things that I'm hearing from Senate Republican leadership staff that they're looking at as ways to fill this hole. We probably won't see them inserted into the legislation for a couple more weeks, way towards sort of mid-December, maybe even no earlier than around the 15th of December. But we're looking at things like repealing the individual mandate, which generates $338 billion. That could be really helpful. Another alternative is to further phase in the corporate tax cuts. So instead of going to 20% in 2019, as the current Senate bill projects, they could delay that another year or two, save a couple $100 billion as well. There's also the proposal that they could be looking at in the future to repeal or at least make temporary some of the individual tax cuts. And I've been sort of trying to dig in with staff on this and understand exactly what they're looking at, because obviously it's politically complicated to pass permanent tax cuts for corporations and only temporary tax cuts for individuals. But the way that Republicans seem to be looking at this dynamic is that once you get into, 2025, 27, 28, you could be looking at a scenario where Democrats would be more comfortable allowing the corporate tax cuts to expire in the future and see those rates rise back to the 30% range. But repealing or allowing the individual tax cuts to fully expire and go back to their current rates would be very unpalatable. So it's a tricky political calculus, but it appears to me, based on my conversations I'm having just this morning, is that it's more palatable to make the individual tax cuts temporary and make the permanent tax cuts apply to corporations and pass-through entities. That would also save you as much as $500, maybe even more billion dollars in the future and help you override the Byrd Rule.
So, Henry, I want to break in a bit of breaking news right now. Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce right now, is speaking in Washington. What just crossed the Bloomberg was that he's saying tax reform doesn't necessarily going to have to affect the dollar at all, which is a little surprising to me because the dollar has been trading, we've thought to some extent, on prospects of tax reform. As they've gone up, the dollar seems to have gone up. As they've gone down, it's gone down. What sense do you make of that as a practical matter? Because if this is really going to cause the economy to grow and all the things that the Republicans say, shouldn't that affect the dollar?
It should affect the dollar. I've got to say, just to take this in slightly a different direction, I was with some trade staff yesterday, Senior Ways and Means Committee Trade Council, and one of the things that would have a far greater impact on the dollar would be if this president decided to pull out of NAFTA. And, I don't want to get too far away from the tax conversation, but that is definitely a prospect that both Democratic and Republican staff on the House and Senate side are deeply concerned with. Now, he extended the conversations over NAFTA with Canada and Mexico into March, but it is widely expected amongst trade circles and on Capitol Hill, on staff on both sides of the aisle, that the president is really looking to shake things up with regards to NAFTA. So while the dollar may be impacted by the corporate tax code and the individual tax code changes they're looking at, I would say that trade is going to be more impactful there.
Yeah, Wilbur Ross actually saying enormously complex to finish NAFTA more or less by March. Let's talk a little bit about the investment community. What's the sense that you're getting now that we're hearing that we could see those corporate tax cuts being delayed? Also, which of the Senate or House bills do they prefer?
It's an interesting question. There are pieces here and there that they would prefer between the House and the Senate bills. In general, though, I think the most intriguing component is that investors are perfectly fine, and certainly our clients are perfectly fine with a more deliberate approach to reducing the corporate tax rate to 20%. Frankly, they don't hold the same ideals of getting to 20% the way that the president or the Freedom Caucus does or Secretary Mnuchin. They're happy with a rate that's below 25%. And most senators and congressmen are happy with a rate that's below 25% as well. So if it requires a phase-in of, 2 or more years, that's perfectly acceptable to the investment community. I would say the one big differential, though, is that the multinational community, who is on the hook for a whole bunch of revenue, including the repatriation tax, changes to the net interest deduction, they're all going to be taxed immediately beginning on Jan 1 of 2018. So they don't like the idea of having to sort of take Congress's word for it that they'll get to this 20% rate in the future. They prefer that happen immediately. But the investment community, and I think even for just a couple years, maybe 1 to 3 years, the multinational and domestic corporate space could be comfortable understanding the complexities of Senate procedures and the Byrd rule with making the implementation of the lower rates take a little bit of time, especially if the trade-off is if they can have the tax cuts be permanent.
So, Henry, I don't want to let you go without talking about state and local taxes, because we just talked with Kevin Brady, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, just 25 minutes ago now. And I was surprised, I must say, because he said there is an absolute red line. He said it was set in concrete that the House of Representatives will never go along with the tax package that doesn't include that provision for $10,000 of real estate. And I had heard, actually, the Senate was in the driver's seat. Does the congressman really mean when he says he will not do it if it includes it?
I saw your interview. That was great. I'm glad you pressed him on it. I've got to say, I suspect that his tone will change in a few weeks' time. The senators are not interested in having a conversation about repeal or reinstituting even the $10,000 property tax deduction included in the House bill. And you can hear it right from them. I mean, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee said the morning the budget, the House tax bill was released, look, we just don't have the same problem. We don't have a New York or California delegation here in the Senate, and it's $1.2 trillion. So while I appreciate that Chairman Brady is trying to appease his caucus in advance of this vote on Thursday, I titled the latest report that I published "Roll Tide" for a reason. I mean, I think that the House Republicans are going to get rolled, and there's not much they can do about it.